Aloha and welcome. Welcome to ThinkTech, where we're raising public awareness about a whole range of issues: technology, global affairs, energy, diversification. As part of the ThinkTech series, this is your show, Global Connections, and I'm your host, Carlos Juarez. I'm delighted to welcome today a very special guest joining us, Susan Stahl. And Susan, thank you for coming on to Global Connections.
It's my pleasure.
I look forward to a conversation, and Susan is, of course, a retired U.S. diplomat. A couple of years ago, she retired from the U.S. Foreign Service after a long career in many different postings, and we'll talk a little bit about that experience. She continues to promote international affairs education and is connected here in Hawaii to a range of organizations. We'll talk a little bit about that, but in particular, an opportunity to really reflect back on a long career in public service, helping support our diplomatic efforts abroad. And so, Susan, perhaps if you have a chance, just give us a quick snapshot where you got into the Foreign Service and where were the postings that you held.
Well, I entered the Foreign Service in 1988, so remember that was before
just at the cusp, at the end of the Cold War.
At the end of the Cold War. I did not serve at any of those places, however. My first assignment was in Lisbon, Portugal, which I was fortunate in all my posts. But, and democracy was just building there.
Yeah, it's a fairly new democracy at that time, of course.
And then my second assignment was in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil.
Brazil, and not too shabby, although, again, another country in transition itself, coming out of a military rule.
Then mayor became president. Not current president, but Lula was president. And then I came back to Washington, and I spent a year studying Chinese, Mandarin Chinese. And then I spent another year studying Mandarin Chinese, so 2 years of study to move to Beijing, where I was an assistant cultural affairs officer there.
And this would be early 90s?
That
roughly?
Was early 90s.
Yeah,
so again, a China that was completely different than the China we have now. Absolutely different.
And beginning to engage and become more globally connected, very fascinating. And of course, I want to reflect on some of those observations as you see China today, what it was like in those early days. You went from China, you had some other important postings, and tell us briefly what some of those were.
Well, from China, I came back to Washington, and I was what we call a desk officer for the, in Western Europe, for Ireland and the UK and Netherlands, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Canada.
So the North America and sort of Northern Europe somewhat.
Completely different. Couldn't be more different than serving in China.
Sure.
But it was a fascinating 2 years that I worked there. Before I went back to the Chinese-speaking world, which is, I spent 4 years in Taiwan at the American Institute in Taiwan because we don't have an embassy there. After that, I came actually here back to Honolulu, worked up with the commander of the Pacific Command here. I was his public diplomacy advisor.
So with the U.S. military, essentially a State Department official providing foreign policy advice and an important role for public diplomacy, right?
Right, this was public diplomacy. It was only one of the major commands that had not only a State Department policy advisor, but also a public diplomacy advisor.
Wow,
that's my expertise is public diplomacy.
So I'll certainly want us to speak a little bit about that in some detail. What does that mean? Because it is an important component of our diplomacy. That is the public diplomacy aspect, and then so PACOM, foreign policy advisor. Anything? I think you had a posting as well in Indonesia.
That was my final posting.
Okay.
I was down there. We were talking earlier about international conclaves, and one of my last assignments was there in Jakarta. Happily, I was there between bombings, and thank God I didn't have any of the violence go on in Indonesia when I was there. But I did help out at the United Nations Conference on Climate Change,
which
was
held there in
Indonesia. In Bali, Indonesia. So then I came back and I worked in Washington for a while, and one of the most meaningful of my assignments, and that was working as on the board of examiners, the people who are responsible for testing and evaluating people who want to be Foreign Service officers.
So based on that extensive experience, bring you back and say, help select and shape, the future diplomats that have come in.
Precisely.
Well, again, another important topic I want us to turn to as we get through some other parts of your experience, because we live in a world now that's never ending, all changes, and at the end of the day, we will always need a diplomatic corps. There needs to be people that work and help represent the interests, help promote our interests, help explain them, and yet both the world is changing and so is our diplomatic service. And I'm curious, maybe from your vantage point, you came in at a time by the late 80s, for many of our country's history, I mean, the traditional diplomats were the sort of very, almost you could say, homogeneous and insular and kind of coming from the elite Ivy Leagues, and there's still some of that, but I can tell you from my vantage point as an educator myself, I mean, we have seen a determined effort to try and diversify the foreign service, let the face of America represent America, because after all, we pride ourselves in the strength of our diversity, and if that diplomatic service doesn't reflect it, it's not probably a genuine one. Now, what would you say to reflect on that, how it's changed from when you came in and maybe more recent times?
I was part of that change. It was before I came in, and right around the time that I came in, there were fewer women than men, and there still are fewer women than men. Yeah. And the number of minorities was I wouldn't say significant, but there were minorities, Asian, South Asians, people from South America, Central America background. When I'm talking about this, I'm talking about American Chinese or American Latin, American Mexican or something like that. And that, as you said, was a deliberate effort, a deliberate policy change on the part of the Department of State to, as you say, make the Foreign Service look like America. And we've been remarkably successful in that. I don't have the numbers, but our diplomatic corps looks more like America than it did certainly when it was established back. The State Department was actually the first department established by the Constitution.
Fascinating, And of course, I mean, at the end of the day, it is an elite service. It has to be because of both the skill set needed and the role and the function of what they do. They are representing the interests of the U.S., representing the president. It's part of his executive team, of course. And it's a fascinating thing to just help people sometimes have this either perception of what it might be, and there are cocktail parties and glamorous things, but more of it is probably the mundane, stamping visas and dealing with challenges of providing services to Americans who are having trouble somewhere abroad. I mean, maybe if you can share a little bit about both, maybe what was the exciting things that came about when you got into it, or other things that maybe you didn't anticipate from getting into that career?
Well, I'll take the second part first. One of the things that embassies overseas do, all embassies, but the American embassies put a focus on this, is American citizen services. So if you're an American living overseas, we reach out to you, the embassy reaches out to you, wants to know where you are in case there's an emergency. And the other part of American citizen services is to take care of Americans when they're linking back to the States in cases of crisis. I was really, unfortunately, at the embassy in Portugal when there was a plane crash. A terrible plane crash. In Portugal itself? In Portugal, actually out in the Azores. And everyone was killed. And there were 5 Americans aboard. So our entire American Citizens Services section,
everything focused on just that, dealing with the emergency.
Talking to the families at home, retrieving the remains, but parts of perhaps what one doesn't really recognize that an embassy does. Every time there's something critical, a crisis that happens, and there are Americans involved, you can bet that the American Citizen Services are right there. And
everything else to drop, that becomes priority. Everybody's focused on.
Of the whole embassy. And that, I think, like I said, I think that was a little bit of a surprise, that it was such a big thing.
That's such an important function, that not only are we, the other parts might be, helping explain and promote and implement our policies. But
Right.
at the end of the day, it's also we are there as a piece of the U.S. government to support Americans who might live there, might be traveling, might be studying or working, and that's a place that clearly functions in that, providing the service, almost like constituent services, but it's
exactly.
yeah.
Our constituency
Yes.
oversees as American citizens.
Yeah.
Now, I wasn't an a consular officer. I don't have a consular credential, but I was working in the public diplomacy side of it. So specifically, our job was to explain the United States to the world.
Yeah.
And we are a terribly complex
Yeah,
society,
yeah.
culture, history, and that's what public diplomacy does.
Yeah,
Because as you well know, the United States is not very well understood overseas, and people who know of America know very little about what really is what we're really about.
Sure.
So.
No, this is an interesting challenge that you're going to have a lot of. In some cases, either contradictory policies or confusing ones, or even explaining to people our political process, how it works.
Exactly.
And that you also then have a world where certainly in the modern period we have delegations of legislators that are coming or business leaders, and people may not always understand the nuances of who's in power, who's what, or some committee chairman that's clearly going to have an influence, and yet how do you make that, and ultimately the challenge of, like you've described, explaining U.S. policy. This is not an easy task, and you've got to this is the diplomatic skill of how do you balance it in a way that's true to what you're explaining, but not offensive or creating more problems, having to manage that message very carefully. And we live in a time, of course, in which the media is evolving so quickly now, and whether you're beginning in the late 80s, early 90s, it's a certain time, but today with instantaneous messaging and social media, how would you describe, I guess, some of the ways in which, even in the time you were there, things were changing, from technologies or from globalization itself?
Well, I think it reflects what we've seen globally, and that is it's a whole new world. It's a whole new world. When I started, and we actually had, we didn't have teletype machines, but we were just starting on personal computers. And the idea of one-to-one communication was way out there. So now it's just been a whole new world when we communicate on all of the social media. And so we're part of that social media network as well, which is, as you know, constantly growing and finding its own identity. And as the State Department moves into that, the American presence moves into that. It's a different sort of world. Sure.
No, these are challenges. So we'll continue unraveling this conversation. I mean, I'm fascinated by, you were at a critical juncture watching the end of the Cold War, countries in transition that have gone through so much, and we're going to continue more on this conversation with Susan Stahl. We're joined by Susan, who's a retired diplomat from the U.S. Foreign Service, brings a wealth of experience, and in particular, as we'll see in the tail end of your career, an opportunity to help, assess and make, I guess, be part of the process of selecting the next generation of diplomats. So join us for more on the story after just a very short break, and we'll be back. We're welcoming you back now to Global Connections. I'm your host, Carlos Juarez, joined today by Susan Stahl, and getting a fascinating conversation going. We're going to unravel some more from her experience and really helping us also understand the changing nature of our world. We live in this globalized, interconnected place. It's a challenge for all of us. It's an opportunity, but someone who's been there sort of in the nitty-gritty details of managing our public diplomacy, and in many ways, much like our show, Global Connections, we bring the world to Hawaii, but we also bring Hawaii to the world. And you're part of that. You're part of that in that you've had a career all over the place. This is your home, and as well, we like to remind many people that Hawaii is not just the hospitality and tourism, which is important. It's a very important place in terms of understanding global issues and being a player. Many retired diplomats, military personnel who are clearly, and business leaders who are clearly helping us affirm Hawaii's place as a globally connected one. Let's get back, Susan, to you're telling us a little bit about your experience in the area of public diplomacy, and it's just in my vantage point, fascinating that you were at several places critical in that they were going through important transitions. Whether it's Portugal, a relatively new democracy by the late 80s, it had a long history of authoritarian rule, and suddenly by that time it was embarking, joining the European community, and is today a pretty firmly established, consolidated democracy. Wasn't the case in the 60s and even into the 70s. You mentioned Brazil, again, in the 80s, a transformed country that would embark on a transition to democracy. In just about 35 days from now, is about to host the opening of the World Cup, the soccer tournament.
Yeah.
We hope that goes well. I
We
think
do.
it will. The Olympics in 2 years is another question. Apparently, I was reading recently that they've come under a lot of criticism. They don't seem to be ready, but will they pull it off? We will see.
We will see.
And more importantly, we'll have some folks there to help explain things. And I was curious, as you described some of your various postings in the Foreign Service, many of them were in the field in public diplomacy positions, and then at times, typical of the Foreign Service, you're brought back to Washington. You kind of keep you grounded and keep you connected to obviously your home country, and you also found yourself shifting from, in this case, Western Europe, Brazil, China, Taiwan, and then suddenly a desk officer for Luxembourg and UK, and very different. But this is also very important. I mean, our Foreign Service officers need to have more than just some singular, narrow focus. And maybe speak a little bit about what are the kind of, I guess, either skill sets or the experience that we look for in diplomats. You need to be somewhat of a generalist at times.
Absolutely.
We need those. Of course, we need people who are very focused and specialize in certain things, but how do you reconcile this balance of, sending someone who studies Chinese, send them off to, different places?
Well, you're right. There are actually two different kinds of Foreign Service officers, and they are specialists and generalists.
Yeah.
And I was a generalist. Most of the people that you would think of as diplomats are generalists. But we have the specialists who run our libraries overseas. We have a lot of different people who actually run programs themselves affiliated with the embassy. The Fulbright program, things like that, where they are specialists.
Yes.
Now, most of the Foreign Service officers I know are generalists, and that means, you have to be know a little bit about a lot of things. Someone said you have to be a Renaissance woman, and I said, well, I don't know about that, but you have to keep your eye on the ball there and on everywhere, because you will be asked questions.
That's right.
And when you are overseas, 24/7, you are representing the United States, and you are a U.S. official. So you really do have to be sure you're saying what is the official word, and people ask you all the time about your personal viewpoint, and it's a matter of, well, that's not important. It's a matter of that's not for the record, basically.
That's right. And as a career civil servant, I mean, the long career you had, I mean, you're going over administrations that come and go, and you're effectively, nonpartisan, because you're there to provide, some continuity. And yet that must be at times challenging, because you've got policy changes, a new team comes in and they see the world differently and they want to do things differently. But at the end of the day, they're not going to replace every single diplomat. They'll replace the top keeper, but the ones who are implementing and sharing, let's say, the story, explaining it, the career civil servants like what you were doing, I mean, you've got to have that ability. And that, are there times where that can be awkward or delicate, or do you just somehow find a way to adapt?
Well, as a public diplomacy officer, I have it easy, because I'm to explain the policy. This is what it is, this is what it is not. And to the media in particular, or to groups of college students or college professors, I get to say just what it is and what it's not. I'm not asked for my own opinion, and I make it clear that my own opinion is irrelevant.
That's not the issue, yes.
The political officers, on the other hand, they need to go into the foreign ministry and say, this is our official position on this. But Carlos, our policy doesn't change very much.
I think this is a fascinating point, because we have a sense that there's profound differences, and on certain issues there might be some particularly more social and cultural and maybe values. But what's remarkable in myself as an educator of foreign affairs, international, there's a tremendous consistency in our policies on one hand, certain enduring things that maybe little nuances that shift here or there, but maybe describe that a little bit more, in the sense that you've worked through many different administrations, but there's a certain level of continuity.
Well, we're out there, and the entire government, I would include the other two branches of government as well. What we're interested in is what our national interests are. And so we're focused on that. And that is not something that changes very much. Now, we're right now going through a lot of public discussion about some of our foreign policy positions. We do under every administration, every administration. And it's a funny thing for me where every country I've been in, when there's been an American election, seems to think that the next president is going to have a different viewpoint of their country. You know, let's be ready for a change. Well, like I said, your fundamental U.S. national interests are not changing significantly.
That's right.
And if they do change, it'll be over the time of the administration, but you're not going to see a great deal of, unless U.S. national interests change significally, which you see them
once in a while. There's some big event that might do that, but at the end of the day, whether if you're dealing with the the American was it American Services or the Citizen Services, I mean, the needs are going to be similar. You're helping people who have crisis or needs or whatever it might be, or otherwise we've got part of our interest is promoting American economic interests, business interests, and those are going to continue in some way. Well, it is fascinating because, again, sometimes from the outside people make assumptions that our leaders are not our leaders, our parties and maybe our administrations are so different. As someone who teaches a lot about our American system to foreigners or comparing our system to others, it is remarkable that there is quite a bit of continuity, and not just that, even our political parties, as different as they are and how difficult they can be today, at the end of the day, they both support a pretty similar sort of capitalist economy and protecting rights and liberties. And I mean, I don't want to underscore, well, no, let me rephrase that. I don't want to downplay the fact that there are differences, no doubt, and political leaders will push those. But compared to a lot of other political systems, you often have stark differences in political parties, or when you have a transition in government, sometimes it can be more, just more radical. Or a country coming out of a transition to become a new democracy, the choices they have are often more stark, and the challenges they face. Well, this is quite fascinating, and I think the other thing I want to maybe briefly touch on, and we'll continue to unravel, after your experience managing public diplomacy issues, you mentioned you were called back to Washington, and you became part of what the Foreign Service Assessment Board, or
the Board of Examiners.
Yeah, the examiner. So describe a little bit what that entails. This is the process of getting into the diplomatic service.
Well, it's tough.
And it needs to be for various reasons, and there are a small number of slots that open every year and a large pool of people that want to be the next diplomat.
And we want those people. We go through this rigorous testing is not because we don't want people. It's because we want the best, and we get the best. The written exam is given just about all over the country and places overseas as well.
Yeah. And that's the first step. You take a written exam for the Foreign Service.
I used to describe that as something between the GMATs and the GREs, to give you a level of the difficulty. Those are tough. Those are tough exams. And somewhere around 15%, 15 to 20% of the people who take that pass it.
So the vast majority don't even get past that stage. And it's a test like those others, but it assesses a lot of different things. I mean, I know, and I myself, gosh, now 30 years ago, I took it a couple of times. I actually went through that next step. But it is one that often people are puzzled by how much it might have some mathematics, it might have some, a lot of management and things that you wouldn't assume. Of course, it has things like your understanding of everything from popular culture to literature, the arts, some geography, some international affairs. But I think what many are struck by is that it's so much more than that, right? I mean, what are some other areas that it tries to test on?
Well, that's the generalist that you're hitting at. That, be it a political officer, we have, I guess it's 5 different cones of officers. We have political officers, economic officers, management officers, public diplomacy officers. Am I skipping someone? I hope not. If I have, I'm sure I'll hear about it.
Consular might be the other one.
Consular, you're right. You're right.
So political, economic,
I
consular,
apologize to all those
management.
consular officers. Each one of those officers needs to have a real broad understanding of the world and how the United States fits in the world.
Yeah, yeah.
We also each need to manage, be able to
Yeah,
manage.
yeah,
You know
yeah.
that you're going to be doing that.
Mm-hmm.
We have to be able to communicate very clearly
Yeah.
and accurately, I would
Mm-hmm.
say. Now we've got, that's one part of it, one way to look at it. That's the first step.
Yeah.
And as you said, you've taken it. It's a tough test.
Yeah.
People take it many, many times.
Mm-hmm.
I was one of the fortunates. I took it once, I passed it and thought, well, I
Yeah.
guess I'm a step ahead. And then the second part is the part that I was involved in Washington,
Mm-hmm.
more involved
Yeah,
in
yeah.
Washington. And that is, and I should say, there are steps in between this written exam and this oral exam. I shouldn't let them go, but there are internal evaluations that are going on. So then you get to the oral exam, and it's, first of all, people come in scared, anxious, just ready to be examined.
Yeah.
And the first thing I'd say is they got to understand that the testers, the examiners, really want them to pass. They don't want, they're not the enemy. They're there to bring out the best in you, so that we can bring in the best into the State Department. And those that structure is extremely well organized. It's actually overseen or designed by an industrial psychologist, who we work with a consultant to make sure that every year the questions and answers are find the qualities that we're looking for. How people solve problems.
Yeah.
Things like that. It's a tough thing to look for. It's a tough thing to test for.
Yeah.
But it's a very, very rigorous exam. And as I said, we're just thrilled when we have people pass it. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people who are terribly crestfallen at the end, and they go back to the beginning and they'll take the exam again, or they'll go off and get their master's degree or their PhD in something else.
And a lot of it in that stage, and part of what you're trying to assess too, you described it briefly, is that how they solve problems and put into role play scenarios, given a situation, here's some information, because at the end of the day, you're operating that way. You've got an embassy that functions, or it might be a consulate if you're even more remote, but that place is a very, sort of closed environment where in the big countries you've got everything there in a huge organization. In the small ones you might have a small team that has to figure everything out. And one of the things, what are the kind of skill sets people might need? I mean, some of it is working with others, because no single person is going to solve everything. So how well do you bring together a team based on the information you have on hand, which is going to be limited, and time, which is going to be very limited. How do you interact? And so, like the assessment that you're doing, you're observing them, you give them these scenarios to kind of play through.
You have interviews, 2 people interview 1, and I forgive me again, I cannot list them all. I should be able to, but we're looking for 13 core values. They include communication, integrity, management skills, things like that. And that's what we tell people to bone up on. That's what I tell people to have ready if asked. Give me a story about when you had a massive, complex problem, and we didn't have enough resources to deal with it. How did you manage it? How did you look at it?
That's right.
You can have that, or how do you deal with some emergency that comes up? You have a huge earthquake. What's
the first thing you do?
What's the first thing you do? How do you think about it? And how do you move? That sort of thing. A lot of practical stuff, as well as the more intellectual general.
Well, fascinating, and again, these are what are required to function and to do effective work in that setting, and they're skills clearly that are broad enough to be applied in many other settings, but for that critical role of diplomacy, working in a foreign place, representing our interests, supporting our citizens abroad, interesting set of skills that are needed. Well, we're going to continue this conversation. We're joined here today by Susan Stahl, who's a retired U.S. diplomat, settled back here in Hawaii a few years ago, and reflecting on a long career in diplomacy, working at many parts around the world. Stay tuned and join us in just a moment. We'll continue with more on the story. And we're back and we're live, and I'm your host Carlos Juarez on the show Global Connections, part of our ThinkTech Hawaii series. Joined today by Susan Stahl, a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer, and Susan, of course, reflecting on a career that took you to many places: Portugal, Brazil, Indonesia, China, Taiwan. And maybe just to step back a moment, I mean, you're describing, of course, that process and the job and duties of a Foreign Service officer, but I'm always intrigued by even just the workings of an embassy, because we have, of course, in 100 and gosh, whatever number of countries around the world, 150 plus, that we have formal embassies, and many big ones with consulates. But in these places, you actually have a full representation of the U.S. The U.S. government. In some big countries, I mean, massive bureaucracies.
Exactly.
Every part of our government is represented there. It's a big team that comes together. Everybody's focused on the mission and what they're doing. But it is a place that also requires, I mean, all kinds of people. And what we think of as the traditional diplomats are really just a fraction of those. You've got, technicians, you've got human resource people, somebody in charge of, planning events that are happening, the outreach to the, local community, and in the role that you did in most cases, public diplomacy, being essentially a spokesperson. You are the voice that has the official word, the explanation, the clarification. Maybe if you could give me a sense of, from your vantage point, having been at different types of postings, I mean, what are things that are common and all, and what are things that are very different if you're in a big, embassy in Beijing or a small posting, elsewhere?
Well, that's a good question. The same thing is that we still are American officials representing the United States 24/7.
Yeah.
We might be in a smaller place or a larger place, but that is what's similar. Also, we represent certainly the executive branch. Actually, the judicial and the legislative branches we will talk about and assist, if you will, but we are part of the executive branch. So in the bigger embassies, as you were just saying, the representation, the people who are there, come from not only State Department. State Department is what holds the place together. Your basic political, economic management is what you've been talking a lot about. American Citizen Services in the consular section. And I shouldn't forget mentioning visas and American passports.
All those that want to come to the U.S. is huge, of course.
Yeah, no matter what's going on in a country, it's very interesting. You could have demonstrators in the front of the embassy, and out back the line goes way back.
People trying to get out of there or come to the U.S.
People trying to come to the U.S. for their visas.
Yeah.
So back to who's there, and in a big one. I worked at actually it was a consulate general, so it wasn't. It was a big consulate. It wasn't the embassy, but first of all, you'll have USAID, American.
The Agency for International Development.
Development, AID. Often their mission is connected with the embassy mission, and often it's directly part of it. They're part of what we call the country team. And the country team can, as you say, be as small as the ambassador or the consul general, a political officer, or maybe a political econ officer, a consular officer. We've got some pretty small operations going on out there where you've got a few people doing a lot of things. But I will say that those are not in very large population places.
That's right.
You don't have a few people trying to run an embassy that represents millions, I shouldn't say, to the world. Each one is different. Each one is tailored, if you will, to that country. So I was saying USAID, the U.S. Department of Commerce, the Foreign Commercial Service, the Department of Agriculture, Foreign Agricultural Service. The Library of Congress has representatives in some places. As I said, in some places yes, in some places no. In some countries you have the IRS. You certainly have, you have Social Security in some. I've worked at places too where, let's see, the FAA had a representative there. So you'll see the whole kind of how the relationship kind of lays out if you look at the kinds of people who are in the embassy. And you have to, I have to say as well, if you're working at one embassy, that doesn't mean you only work at that embassy. You're often, especially for the smaller representation, like say you're a foreign commercial officer, they'll have their own office, their own operation.
You might be in charge of a bigger area because you don't have a rep every place.
Exactly. So they will. Our medical officers, it's kind of interesting. They fly from place to place to place to place, and when I say medical officer, that would be officers who take care of. They're specialists who are looking after the people inside the embassy. They're not outside the embassy. And their area of responsibility is tremendous.
Pretty broad, that's right. And then somebody's getting them there and paying their checks and getting them the supplies they need. And so it's just mind-boggling, just the day-to-day operations of a place like that, and we, being the large country, the large industries we have, I mean, these are big operations, mega. And the other part, I can just envision, we live in a world today where we all take for granted our smartphones, our iPads, our computers, and the social media. But clearly, at a time for most of our history, we had maybe there was a cable coming, or maybe some dialogue, but otherwise it might be literally the slow boat that took things even in the world that you were doing. And
those days are gone.
Now it's just instantaneous. I have memories when I was in the early 90s. I lived briefly in South America, in Colombia, and I had a close connection with many of those working in the embassy. And I'll never forget the stories they told me at that time about some of the old computers they had. They couldn't even talk to each other. And meanwhile, the outside world was moving quickly to kind of become a lot more efficient, let's
You'd
say.
have one computer for the whole section.
And I would hope that that's beginning to change now, and we do have, and actually several of our own recent alumni from here are now serving in the Foreign Service. And they're on social media. They're obviously, this new generation are much more connected, and our diplomatic service needs that. They need people who understand the new technologies, right? And this, again, especially from the vantage point of public diplomacy, where you do want to control the message. You want to obviously have close relations with the media to know who's helping inform. But we have to constantly stay up on these changing technologies in a way that must be quite. Just again, the ground is always shifting.
It is. It has passed me by, I have to say. I guess I've been retired for a little over 2 years, and there are so many new. I mean, we were on Twitter when Twitter started, but you know how long ago that was? That's just gone into ancient history compared to all of the different social networks that are out there and what you can do with them. The photos that you can save and messages that you can send and that sort of thing.
Well, no, fascinating. And I wonder, again, maybe as we get to wind down some of this, you've described already some of that process going through helping to recruit and bring in the next generation of diplomats. And, at the end of the day, on one hand, we need a diverse set of people with expertise in areas and et cetera, but we also need people who've got a certain set of qualities and skills, and maybe not everyone has the same one, but they have certain ones that we're looking for, maybe the set of things that you've described. If you have to step back and think just off the top of your head, what are some of the, I guess, competencies and skills that are indispensable that that you look for in people? Good judgment, good something about character, but resourcefulness and ability to kind of work with limited resources and information, and people skills, working with others.
You've just named a number of those core competencies that we look for when we administer the examination or the whole administration.
And yet, I have to imagine some of these are, you go through a testing and assessment process where you can see those and find evidence of it, but there are others that maybe you might not have the ability to see, but maybe you can ascertain, well, they could be trained, or we could, there's certain level of things that obviously the State Department, like any other agency, we will train you on that. Don't worry about that. Maybe it's the style of communication or something. What are some of the things that you might describe that are more wait till we bring you in and then we'll give you that skill set?
Well, one thing that people think is very unusual in terms of bringing in skill sets is you don't have to have a foreign language. Mm-hmm. You do not have to be fluent in any other language other than English. Mm-hmm. You must be very fluent in English and be able to communicate clearly. Mm-hmm. But most people think that we're looking only at foreign affairs colleges and places that have a strong, foreign, what do they call it, the foreign service school, if you will. Yeah, no. And we don't have a foreign service school. Mm-hmm. What we do have is the Foreign Service Institute, which is part of the State Department. Yeah, yeah. And it sits on the campus of the National Foreign Affairs Training Center. Mm-hmm. And that's where we give them these skills that you're talking about. Yeah, yeah. We don't send an economics officer out to the field without he or she having had the basics, and then they come back and get the mediums, and then the more senior they become, the more the broader their knowledge and their ability to interact with senior government officials. And be able to explain that. Yeah. But let me get to another simple way that we describe things, and that is perhaps it's a public diplomacy way of looking at things, but I think it's a whole diplomacy that we deal with now. Mm-hmm. We're talking about social media, we're talking about technology and all that, and all very, very important. But you know what? We say the important thing is the last 3 feet. Yeah. And that's where it comes down to it. Sure. But some of my favorite experiences overseas have been to have had a conversation with a foreigner who doesn't know that much about the United States or who has the wrong idea about something, and to have this conversation with them, at the end of which they say, "Oh, really?" Yeah, that's had a greater impact on me than anything I could read or. That's exactly how I feel. That it's. And I think it speaks to, at the end of the day, whatever our technologies and all, it is about people and people, interactions. It's a sort of citizen diplomacy of sorts. Some of that, and we'll have to save this for another chance to have a conversation about. But part of what is involved in our cultural diplomacy is also, the people-to-people exchange. You mentioned Fulbright and other type of things. Yes. We bring a lot of people here at the Visitor Leadership Program, and ultimately those human-to-human interactions are so vital. You've got to break through the perceptions and the different, media input and have that person-to-person contact. Well, this is a very good way to, I think, end it, because while we have all these other things, all the experts you may know, it's probably talking to somebody and seeing, their true their true meaning that we probably have a greater impact. And yet it's not always immediate. Sometimes it might be you've planted this seed that will impact them in the longer term. Yeah. In particular, those exchange programs, which I could go on about. Yeah, no, this is we'll do this as a next conversation, because there's a lot that goes on there, and those are always under attack. Of course, they're an easy target to say, well, no, we don't need to spend on this or that, but the challenge is that the results are not always immediate. I mean, you're planting the seed for somebody that will impact them in the long term. And we've done a lot of hosting of visitors and through educational exchanges, and it's no doubt those are life-changing experiences that will go a long way, and that anybody who understands them knows we need to continue that, and particularly Fulbright, who saw that at the end of World War II, that we need a world to break down that misunderstanding, because otherwise we create walls and barriers. Right, exactly. Yes. Well, Susan, I'm going to have to close us on that. A great conversation. I want to thank you for sharing your insights from your long experience with the Foreign Service as a career diplomat. Thank you for helping represent U.S. interests as they were consistently done over the many different administrations, and giving us some insights, especially into the skills and the nature of the work. For those who've been listening, we've been joined today by Susan Stahl, a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer, a career that took her to many places and embassies in Lisbon, and consulate in Rio, and Jakarta, and Taipei, and Beijing, and fascinating stories that, again, you've been able to enlighten us with. I thank you for that, and for our guests for joining us here. This has been another episode of Global Connections, and stay tuned and stay connected with us here. You can get all of our links and copies of old shows at ThinkTechHawaii.com. And I want to thank all those who helped make the show possible. We'll just stay tuned for our next show coming up next week. Join us here on ThinkTechHawaii.com. Thank you. Aloha.